Here are some important messages from The Fundable Startup: How Disruptive Companies Attract Capital. I'm going to talk briefly about what makes The Fundable Startup a different book about startups and some of the important messages, including: is Steve Jobs' law valid? What is a fundable idea? What's a fundable management team? What does it mean to compete for capital? What's the right balance between entrepreneurism and management? How should you think about competition? How important is a pitch deck, and how should it deal with your competition? One of the most important topics for investors. When I started to think about writing The Fundable Startup, I asked myself, why would this book be different from any other book about startups? The answer is simple. Very few, if any, other authors have the experience I have had with startups from four completely different compass points: as a corporate strategic planning executive working on startups within large corporations, as a venture capital fund manager, as an angel investor and founder or co-founder of the largest angel investment group in the US, and as a co-founder of 6 companies. That breadth of experience has exposed me to many different companies, markets, products, technologies, and management and governance situations. One of the driving forces for me in writing The Fundamental Startup was an abiding conviction that Steve Jobs' law is rarely valid. Steve Jobs' law states that founders make the best CEOs. That might have been the case for Steve Jobs and maybe for Bill Gates, but not many founders have managed their startups all the way to success. Most CEOs are not overnight successes. Most successful CEOs have worked at it for 15 to 20 years, climbing a corporate ladder one rung at a time. The average CEO is 45 years old. So when first-time CEOs move directly from a laboratory or engineering lab or individual contributor assignment to a CEO job, they often do not have the skills required to succeed. When I managed 3i Ventures, of the 12 companies where I invested directly, I was instrumental in replacing the CEO for 7, simply because the 7 were not meeting their objectives. One of the key ingredients for a fundable startup is a fundable CEO. To venture capital investors, this means a CEO they can trust to accomplish the company's objectives. This usually means a CEO with some prior track record as a CEO and a number of references who can testify as to his or her competence as a CEO. This information sometimes is daunting or disappointing for an exuberant entrepreneur to hear, but it's important to understand the investor's point of view. In a recent word study, I discovered that the words most frequently associated with entrepreneur are passion and determination, whereas the words most associated with the word CEO are management and process. To me, there's a bit of a disconnect here. Obviously, investors want founders and CEOs who are entrepreneurial, but they also need founders and CEOs who are experienced managers. The other key ingredient of a fundable startup is a fundable idea. What's a fundable idea? Investors are looking for an opportunity to make a significant return on the investment and to control risk as much as possible. For them, a fundable idea is an idea that has significant financial potential, usually at least $50 to $100 million in sales by year 5, sometimes more, some unfair competitive advantage that provides some assurance that the company won't get knocked off by competition. All of these usually imply that the company's product solves a problem that is very important to a substantial group of potential customers. One of the most critical messages of the fundable startup is that when startups raise capital, they must compete with other highly attractive startups. Venture capital investors typically have 50 business plans on their desks, some of which contain highly fundable ideas and highly fundable management teams. The VCs will generally pick the opportunity with the most fundable management team and the most fundable business concept. So if your startup is raising capital, you need to assume that you are competing against other highly qualified startup companies. This is contrary to the assumption many startups make that their mousetrap is the best in the world and people will beat a path to their doorstep. What's the role of a pitch deck? Most startup CEOs think of a pitch deck as an appeal for capital, a ticket for capital. It's certainly true that your startup will need a pitch deck when it approaches investors for capital, but many of the most successful startups develop a sort of pitch deck for their own internal purposes. Maybe it should be called a strategic plan instead of a pitch deck. Good companies prepare this strategic plan as a way of describing their strategy for internal communication purposes. That is, describing it so that all members of the team have the same understanding of the strategy. An internal plan covers at least the same topics as a pitch deck, but it might cover more topics and it might cover topics in more detail. PowerPoint is a convenient format for this internal strategic plan as it facilitates efficient discussion, communication, problem solving, and making changes when necessary. At the appropriate time, the strategic plan can evolve to become the company's pitch deck. One of the most important topics for both a strategic plan and a pitch deck is competition. The question investors want answered is, what are the dynamics of this industry? What is the basis for competition? What does the industry look like today, and what makes us think we can establish a competitive position? What will be our strategy for establishing it and maintaining an unfair competitive advantage? The Bible for competitive analysis is Michael Porter's book, Competitive Strategy. It lays out a step-by-step process for understanding the competitive dynamics within an industry in terms of competitive dynamics, buyer issues, supplier issues, substitute products, and alternative approaches. The product matrix that many companies use to describe competition does not really answer the question that investors are asking. The question is not, how do your product features compare? The question is, what are the competitive dynamics of your industry, and what is your strategy for competing successfully? So there you have some key points from The Fundable Startup. This book was written to help create successful startups. I hope it helps you make your startup successful.